The decision to leave the church was inevitable. Martin and I had spent countless nights sitting in the dim glow of our candlelight, discussing the growing dangers outside. The infected weren't the only threat anymore. Supplies were running low, and the barricades we had built felt more fragile with every passing day. The church, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. "We can't stay here forever," Martin said one evening, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "The infected are getting bolder. It's only a matter of time before they break through." "I know," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. "But where do we go? Walking out there is a death sentence, and we don't have the supplies to make it far on foot." Martin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We need a vehicle. Something that can take us far from here. Somewhere quiet, somewhere the infected haven't reached yet." I laughed bitterly. "And where exactly is that? The whole world's gone to hell. Every town, every city, it's all the same." "Not everywhere," Martin said, a hint of determination in his voice. "There's gotta be places the infected haven't spread, places too remote or isolated. But we'll never get there without wheels." "Okay, let's say we find a vehicle. Where do we even start looking? Most of the cars around here are stripped or useless." Martin's eyes met mine, a spark of resolve igniting in his gaze. "The quarantine outpost." I stared at him, incredulous. "You're joking, right? That place is crawling with soldiers. They'd shoot us on sight if we got too close." "Not if we're smart about it," he said. "They have vehicles, supplies, everything we need to get out of here. It's risky, yeah, but it's our best shot." The idea was insane, but it also made a twisted kind of sense. The quarantine zone was a fortress, heavily guarded and stocked with everything the military needed to maintain control. If we could get in and take what we needed, we would stand a chance at survival. "All right," I said after a long pause. "Let's say we go for it. How the hell do we pull this off? We're two people against an entire outpost." Martin leaned back, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll have to scout it out first. Figure out their routines, their weak points. There's no way we're walking in blind. And once we're in, we find a vehicle, load it up with whatever supplies we can carry, and get out fast." It sounded simple when he said it, but I knew better. Nothing about this plan would be easy. The soldiers weren't just fighting the infected, they were fighting to maintain control in a world that had spiraled into chaos. If they caught us, we'd be as good as dead. "We'll need a distraction," I said, my mind already running through the possibilities. "Something to draw their attention away whilst we make our move." Martin nodded. "And we'll need to move fast. Once they realize what we're doing, it'll be a race to get out of there alive." The weight of the plan settled heavily between us, but there was no turning back. Staying in the church was a death sentence, and this, as crazy and dangerous as it felt, was our only chance. "We'll start tomorrow," Martin said. "At first light, we'll head out and scout the outpost. See what we're up against." I nodded, a mixture of fear and determination swirling in my chest. "Tomorrow." As I lay on the cold, hard floor of the church that night, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led us to this point. The world was unrecognizable, a nightmare brought to life. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was enough to keep me going. The first day was about finding a safe spot. After hours of carefully navigating through back alleys and overgrown streets, we discovered an abandoned factory with a partially intact second floor that offered a clear view of the quarantine zone's perimeter. From there, we could see the tall fences topped with barbed wire, the floodlights that bathed the area in harsh brightness, and the soldiers patrolling the gates. "We need to figure out their routine," Martin whispered. "Every shift, every guard rotation, every weak spot." I clutched my binoculars tightly. I remember spending hours watching the soldiers move. noting the times when the patrols shifted and when supply trucks entered and exited the compound. I understood pretty fast that this was no small operation. The quarantine zone was a fortress, its defenses tight. The soldiers worked in teams, always keeping an eye on one another, and the gates were manned around the clock. Our first day of surveillance was disappointing. "They're too organized," I muttered. "There's no obvious weak point." "We'll find one," Martin said with quiet determination. "We just have to keep watching." The next day we returned to the factory at dawn. This time we focused on the soldiers themselves. There were about 24, a mix of hardened veterans and younger recruits. The veterans moved with efficiency, but on the other hand, the younger soldiers, although disciplined, occasionally let their guard down, smoking their cigarettes during quiet moments or chatting when they thought no one was watching. "Bingo," I muttered under my breath. "The younger ones are the weak link. If we're going to create a distraction, it'll have to be during their shift," Martin nodded. "Even if we manage to slip past them, how do we deal with the others?" "We'll figure it out," Martin said, though his tone betrayed his own uncertainty. "For now, we keep watching." By the third day, our supplies were running dangerously low. Meals consisted of stale crackers and sips of water, and our energy was waning. Still, we pressed on, returning to the factory at dawn and staying until dusk. My notebook was filled with information, patrol timings, gate activity, and any unusual occurrences. We noticed that supply trucks arrived every evening around 6 p.m, and their cargo was inspected by a team of soldiers before being allowed inside. "This could be our opportunity," I said, skeptical, waiting for Martin. "You're right," he agreed firmly. On the fourth day, we shifted our focus to the fences. The chain-link barriers were reinforced with steel posts, and the barbed wire at the top would make climbing nearly impossible. However, there was a section near the western edge that seemed less heavily patrolled. The floodlights in that area flickered occasionally, suggesting a potential blind spot. "If we can time it right, we might be able to get through there," I suggested, though my voice lacked confidence. Martin shook his head. "Too risky. We'd be exposed for too long." "So, what's the alternative? We can't just sit here and starve whilst we wait for the perfect opportunity." Martin placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll figure it out, but rushing in will only get us killed." By the fifth day, desperation was beginning to take its toll. We identified the key players among the soldiers. The commanding officer, a no-nonsense woman who rarely left the central building, the supply officer, who seemed to oversee the truck inspections, and the younger recruits who often worked the night shifts. But knowing who we were up against didn't make the task any less daunting. "We need a distraction," Martin said that evening as we huddled in the factory, our voices low to avoid attracting attention. "Something big enough to draw most of the soldiers away from the gates." "Like what? We don't have explosives or anything like that." Martin thought for a moment, then said, "Fire." "Fire? If we can set something ablaze near the eastern perimeter, it might force them to divert their attention." "And while they're distracted, we make our move?" "Exactly." The sixth day was mostly spent collecting the tools for the operation. Anything we could find worked. That night we sat in the factory. The weight of what we were about to do was consuming me. "What if it doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has to. We don't have a choice," Martin replied. By the seventh day, our food was gone. My stomach growled constantly, and Martin's movements had become sluggish. We couldn't afford to wait any longer. As we prepared to leave the factory for what could be the last time, I was afraid. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Martin nodded. His expression was grim. "We don't have a choice." As we silently approached the quarantine zone through the shadows, I could feel my heart pounding. The plan was simple but dangerous. set the shed on fire, use the chaos to slip through the western blind spot, and make our way to the vehicle lot. But even the best laid plans could go horribly wrong. I've seen it in too many movies, too many times. Everything started smoothly. We crept through the tall grass, just like we had planned. The shift change happened exactly on schedule, and the distraction worked like a charm. As the soldiers hurried towards the shed, Martin and I made our move, slipping through the shadows toward the vehicles. Once the area cleared enough, Martin rushed for the vehicles, while I headed for the small guardhouse. The keys had to be inside. I rushed in, panic rising in my chest, when I spotted the keys. I grabbed them, but before I could turn back, I heard the sharp click of a gun behind me.
"Hands where I can see him!"
The soldier screamed at me. I froze, trembling. Was this it? Before I could react, I saw Martin strike the soldier down, his axe burying itself in the man's head, killing him instantly. The soldier fired a few shots, one of them catching me in the leg. The gunfire drew the attention of more soldiers. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Martin and I ran for one of the vehicles, but my wound slowed me down. It hurt so much. I lagged behind, and the soldiers quickly closed the gap, opening fire, making escape impossible. Martin fired back, but it was clear we were outgunned and outnumbered. The soldiers kept advancing. I remember Martin looking at me as I frantically tried to patch my leg up. "Hey kid, survive." With that, Martin turned and sprinted away from the vehicle, using the last of his ammunition to fight back. Soldiers chased after him, but some stayed behind, aware of my position. I quickly climbed into the vehicle and started the engine. With the opening Martin gave me, I couldn't afford to hesitate. Slamming the pedal to the floor, I drove forward, forcing soldiers to leap out of the way. I smashed through the gates, barely making it, and sped off into the distance, tears streaming down my face. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a landscape of desolation. I didn't dare to look back. The rearview mirror reflected only darkness, and the faint glow of the quarantine zone receded behind me. My hands were trembling as they gripped the wheel, and every bump in the road sent a fresh jolt of pain through my injured leg. Blood soaked the makeshift bandage I wrapped around it. Just a torn strip of my shirt, and the coppery smell filled the air inside of the vehicle. The vehicle's headlights illuminated the eerie abandoned world ahead. Burnt-out cars lined the road, their frames rusted, like ghosts of a life that had long since crumbled. Buildings with shattered windows stood silent, their interiors swallowed by shadows. Occasionally I spotted signs of the infected, smears of dried blood on walls, a single shoe abandoned in the middle of the road, or worse, the faint shuffling of figures in the distance. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I drove for hours, maybe days. Time had lost all meaning. The further I got, the quieter the world became. No gunfire, no screams, no growls. Just the hum of the engine and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. I felt alone. Once in the countryside, fields stretched out endlessly on the other side of the road. The horizon was painted in shades of gold and green, broken only by the occasional silhouette of a lone tree or a dilapidated farmhouse. It was beautiful in a way. The supplies Martin and I had gathered during the heist had lasted me well, giving me enough food, water, and fuel to keep going. But even with the stockpile, the weight of survival pressed heavily on me. I knew I couldn't rely on luck forever. The infected might be far behind me now, but they always seemed to find a way to catch up. And there were other dangers. Bandits, starvation, my own exhaustion. As night began to fall, I stumbled upon a massive wheat field. The golden stalks swayed gently in the breeze, their tops catching the fading light and creating an almost ethereal glow. I parked the vehicle and stepped into the field, the wheat brushing against my arms as I pushed through. The sound of the stalks rustling was strangely soothing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe. The field seemed to stretch on endlessly, a sea of gold beneath a dark sky. I found a small rise near the center of the field. I returned to my vehicle and parked it there, leaving it hidden amongst the tall wheat. The stars began to emerge as the sky darkened, their light piercing through the vast emptiness above. It was beautiful and haunting all at once. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a meal bar and some water. Rationing had become second nature, but for once I ate and drank freely, knowing I had enough supplies to last a little while longer. As I ate, my mind wandered back to Martin. His face, his voice, his last words. The guilt was a constant weight on my chest, heavier than anything I'd ever carried. He saved me. He gave me a chance to survive, and I'd repaid him by driving away. I could still see him in my mind, standing there as the soldiers closed in, buying me time to escape. Survive, he'd said. But surviving felt like a hollow victory. I stared out at the field, the wheat bending and swaying like waves in the ocean. In the distance, I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shadow. My hand instinctively went to the knife at my side, the only weapon I had left. But after a few moments of watching, the shadow disappeared, and I convinced myself that it had been my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The night passed slowly. I didn't dare to sleep. The risk was too great. Instead, I sat there, watching the stars and listening to the wind rustle through the wheat. Every sound made my heart race. The distant hoot of an owl, the creak of a tree trunk I leaned against, the faint rustle of something moving through the field. I clutched my knife tightly, ready to defend myself if the infected or anything else appeared. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, I forced myself to my feet. My leg protested with a sharp stab of pain, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through it. I couldn't stay here. The field might have felt safe for a moment, but I knew better. Nowhere was truly safe anymore. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and began walking again, using the sun to guide me east. The wheat field stretched on for miles, and the quiet was almost maddening. But as I walked through the stalks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own labored breathing. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the whisper of the wheat. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the field that I realized how wrong I'd been. There, in the distance, was a figure, not shuffling like the infected, but standing still, watching me. My grip tightened on the knife as I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and hope. The figure didn't move at first, but they raised their hand, a gesture of peace. As they stepped closer, I could see it was a woman, her face gaunt and tired, but human. She carried a rifle slung over her shoulder and a pack much like mine. When she was close enough, she stopped, keeping a cautious distance. "You alone?" she asked, her voice wary. I nodded, too stunned to say anything. She studied me for a moment, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "You look like you could use some help." I wanted to cry, to collapse right there and beg for her assistance, but instead I nodded again, forcing myself to stand tall. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I could." She stepped a little closer, her hands still raised slightly, showing me she meant no harm. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, her tone softer now. "That leg, you're hurt." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, though it was an obvious lie. My leg throbbed with every step, and the exhaustion weighed on me like a heavy chain. "I've been through worse." She raised an eyebrow, not buying it. "What's your name?" Liam, I said after a pause. Yours? Emma, she replied. Her gaze flicked to the wheat field behind me, as if scanning for signs of danger. Where are you headed? Anywhere but here. I've been driving for days, just trying to stay ahead of everything. Emma nodded knowingly. The infected, then the soldiers, I added, her expression darkened slightly at that, and I could tell she understood exactly what I meant. You got a vehicle? She asked me, glancing past and towards the field. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, it's hidden back there. For the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Smart. Most people would have parked it right out in the open. I'm not most people, I said, though the words felt hollow. Surviving this long didn't make me special, just lucky. And luck runs out. Emma shifted her weight, clearly debating something in her head. Finally, she said, Look, I've been on my own for a while now. Traveling is easier with two people. Safer, too. If you're heading somewhere, maybe we can go together. I studied her face, trying to read her intentions. She looked as tired and desperate as I felt, but there was a steadiness in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been completely snuffed out by this nightmare of a world. Yeah, I said, surprising even myself with how quickly I agreed. We can stick together. We made our way back to the vehicle, moving cautiously through the wheat. Emma had a sharpness about her, constantly scanning our surroundings for threats. When we reached the vehicle, she let out a low whistle. You really came out of that quarantine zone with this thing? It wasn't exactly smooth, I said, trying to keep my voice even. The memories of Martin's sacrifice were still too raw. But yeah, I did. Emma glanced at me, probably sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't push. Instead, she climbed into the passenger seat, setting her rifle across her lap. Let's go then. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely something is to find us. I nodded, starting the engine. The vehicle rumbled to life, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of safety. We drove east, following the rising sun. We went past fields, forests, the occasional crumbling house or barn. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Emma and I didn't talk much at first. The weight of survival hung between us, heavy and unspoken. But as the miles stretched on, the silence became unbearable. So, I said, breaking it, how'd you manage to stay alive out here? Emma glanced at me, a small smirk splaying across her lips. I'm resourceful. Grew up hunting with my dad, so I know how to handle a rifle. And I don't trust anyone easily, which helps. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. Smart. What about you? She asked, leaning against the back seat. You look like you've been through hell. I let out a bitter laugh. You could say that. I had someone with me, a friend. We were trying to survive together, but my voice trailed off and I shook my head, unable to finish the sentence. Emma didn't press me. Instead, she looked out the window, her expression somber. Everyone's lost someone. We drove in silence for a while after that, the conversation hanging heavy between us. But as the sun climbed higher, warming the world around us, the mood began to shift. Emma started pointing out little things, a hawk circling in the distance, a cluster of wildflowers growing alongside the road. It was the first time in weeks I noticed anything other than the constant threat of death. Hours later, my phone buzzed. The sound startled me so much I nearly slammed on the brakes. I pulled the phone from my pocket, staring at the screen in disbelief. Notifications. Dozens of them. I had a signal. We pulled off of the road, parking near a cluster of trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, I opened my messages, my social media, my email. Most of the notifications were old, months-old messages, and news alerts had been waiting to come through. But a few were new. One caught my eye. Emergency broadcast. UN coalition deploys aid to unaffected zones. Holy shit, I whispered, reading the headline. What is it? Emma asked, leaning over to look at my screen. I showed her the message. Her eyes widened. You think it's real? Aid? That could mean other places are still functioning. Maybe, I said, my voice tinged with hope and doubt in equal measure. Or it could just be false hope. Propaganda to keep people calm. Emma frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she scrolled through her own phone, reading whatever she could find. It says some areas in Europe and Asia are still holding strong. Fortified zones, minimal outbreaks. Maybe it's not bad news everywhere. The thought was almost too much to process. For so long, survival had been my only focus. The idea that there might still be places where life continued, where people weren't just trying to stay alive but actually living, it felt impossible. But if there was even a chance, it was worth finding out. What do you think? Emma asked, her voice quiet. Do we head towards one of these zones? Try to find somewhere safe? I stared at the screen, the notifications blinking like tiny beacons of hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt something other than fear or despair. I felt possibility. Yeah, I said, my voice firm. And just like that, the horizon didn't seem so empty anymore. Emma and I sat in the vehicle for what felt like hours, the screen of my phone glowing in the dim light as we scrolled through article after article, notification after notification. The initial spark of hope I had quickly began to dim. With every line I read, that hope shriveled up, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. Our country was quarantined, completely sealed off from the rest of the world. Borders closed, no flights, no ships, no way in or out. The emergency measures had been put into place months ago, but the details were only now filtering through. The reason was simple and brutal. The infection was too widespread here. The rest of the world had decided that we were a lost cause. Until every single infected was eradicated, no one was coming to help. I stared at the words, unable to process them. My hands were trembling, and I felt the bile rising in my throat. No way in, no way out. The phrase looped in my head. Emma leaned over. Her face was pale as she read over my shoulder. Liam, this can't be right. They can't just leave us here to die. But they have, I said, my voice hollow. My throat felt tight, like it was being strangled by the weight of the truth. We're on our own. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence in the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. My hands clenched around the phone, the plastic case creaking under the pressure. All that hope, all those dreams of finding a safe haven somewhere beyond this nightmare were crushed in an instant. The realization was suffocating. Emma eventually broke the silence. We need to keep moving. Find somewhere safe where we can think this through. I nodded numbly, shoving the phone back into my pocket. My chest felt heavy, like someone had strapped a boulder to it. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. The sound was a small comfort, a reminder that at least the vehicle still worked. We pulled back onto the road, heading east once more. Emma tried to make small talk a few times, asking about my life before everything went to hell, but I could barely respond. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, swirling with images of Martin's face, the warehouse, and now the knowledge that there was no escape. My sanity felt like it was hanging by a thread. The scenery outside began to change again, the flat field giving way to rolling hills and patches of dense forest. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dull grey light that only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Every so often, I'd spot a cluster of abandoned vehicles on the side of the road, or a burned-out farmhouse in the distance, signs of life that had been snuffed out long ago. Emma's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. He should find somewhere to stop soon. I glanced at the fuel gauge. We still had plenty, thanks to the stockpile from the quarantine zone, but I knew she wasn't talking about gas. She was talking about shelter, somewhere to rest, to regroup, to figure out what the hell we were supposed to do next. Yeah, I said quietly. My voice sounded foreign to me, distant and detached. Let's keep an eye out. It took another couple of hours before we found a place that seemed suitable. It was an old rest stop, tucked off to the side of a long-forgotten highway. The building was small and weathered, the paint peeling off of its walls, but it looked intact. More importantly, it looked empty. We parked the vehicle behind the building, hidden from the road, and approached cautiously. Emma took the lead, her rifle at the ready, while I limped along behind her with my knife in hand. My leg was still a mess, but the bleeding had stopped, and I could move a little better now. The rest stop was quiet. Too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet set my nerves on edge. Emma methodically cleared each room, her movements precise and practiced. It was clear she'd done this sort of thing before. By the time she gave the all clear, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my knife. "It's safe," she said, lowering her rifle. "At least for now." We set up camp inside, barricading the doors and windows as best we could. The supplies from the vehicle were brought inside, and we took stock of what we had. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, enough to last us a little while, but not forever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Emma lit a small lantern she'd found in one of the cabinets. The warm light filled the space, pushing back the darkness and making it feel just a little less oppressive. That night we sat across from each other on the floor, sharing a can of soup. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. "So," Emma said, breaking the silence, "what did you do before all this?" I hesitated, unsure if I even remembered anymore. "I was a student," I said finally. "College. Studying engineering, but I dropped out." "Oh. And you?" Her expression grew distant, like she was hiding something. "Sorry if it's a sensitive..." I tried to apologize, but I was cut short by her voice again. "It's nothing. I don't like talking about the past." I didn't blame her. She shrugged, poking at her soup with a spoon. "I wanted a normal life, I guess. Funny how that worked out." The next morning, we decided to move again. The rest stop was safe for now, but it was too exposed, too close to the road. We needed somewhere more secluded, somewhere we could stay longer without constantly looking over our shoulders. We packed up the supplies and loaded them back into the vehicle. My leg protested with every step, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through the pain. Emma offered to drive, and I didn't argue. My mind was too foggy to focus on the road anyway. As we drove, Emma's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the screen. "Still have a signal," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Barely, but it's there." "Good," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. The signal felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like a cruel joke. What good was staying connected if the rest of the world had written us off? We drove for hours, stopping occasionally to check on our surroundings or stretch our legs. The landscape grew wilder as we moved further from civilization, with dense forests and rocky hills replacing the open fields. By the time the sun had begun to set, we found a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was old and weathered, but it looked sturdy. More importantly, it was isolated. The perfect place to disappear for a while.